Okay. So when I want you to, do you have questions about the reading for this week that you'd like to raise? And then I'll do some talking. So let's get out of the way some questions. Go ahead.
Okay. My first question is, in the chapters from your book that we had to do the reading on, and all the myths and how it affects like the present conflict, I was wondering how the myths affect atheists in these societies, or like pure secularists that don't buy into this. And then my second question is, you wrote about unique injury, specifically within the negotiations where a Palestinian man was comparing the Palestinian situation to the Holocaust. And I was just wondering, I was reading last week, John Dugard, he's the UN representative working with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and he compared the occupied territories to apartheid. So it just made me think of what you were talking about with unique injury. And I was wondering if it's okay for other injured groups to say that something is comparable to their unique injury, and if that was the case, are there Israelis that do compare like the Palestinian situation or draw parallels between like the Holocaust, for example?
Okay, well, those are much larger questions than you might imagine, and let me go with the first one first. The first one being, just jog my memory, is the issue
of myths and affecting like
myths and affecting atheists and secular. Yeah. The reason why myth is so important in this conflict and many others, and story and traditional stories, is not because of its effect on a few religious people, even if they're the minority. And let me just digress for a moment and say that what I had framed for you earlier as the religious foundations of Zionism in the story is an impressionistic story. In other words, if you have a religion that focuses on the story of the promise to Abraham of a land for his progeny, the dramatic story of enslavement in Egypt and liberation, all with the mind of reaching eventually the promised land, you have the makings of what would be proto-Zionism. And then if you have on top of that rabbinic prayers and institutions for 2,000 years that reminded people that they're not in the promised land and that that's the place of fulfillment, you have the makings of how somebody could easily work with that and turn it into a political movement. But it should be said that technically speaking, for the ultra-Orthodox or the truly religious position, for 2,000 years, the sense was that only the Messiah, whoever that may be, would take the people back to Israel and create a kingdom on earth that would be permanent. For them, a restoration of the land, change of history, whole change of the way everybody is in the world. Everybody will acknowledge one God, one good. The righteous will be victorious and all of that. Very much a post-historical analysis. And so the resistance to Zionism was very fierce among ultra-Orthodox people, and many to this day, because it really was anti-religious, it was anti-Orthodox. The idea that you take history into your hands as opposed to waiting for God to do this. So you have the makings and the building blocks of a Zionist idea that's going to really touch the Jewish soul, particularly in the context of 1,000 years of miserable history in Europe, and frankly 2,000 years in which the Jewish community, and they never really quite articulate this, but the sense that Islam and Christianity took over from Judaism, took a lot from Judaism, and then made it inferior. You have the makings of these opportunities for empowerment in the modern world that lots of people are feeling. Not just the Jews, but many minorities around the world are feeling the opportunity for empowerment. And when you feel that, you start dredging up all the reasons why you've been inferior until now. And the sense is that enough is enough of history of Jews being a minority in either Christian lands or Muslim lands. Surely the worst was in Europe. No legitimacy, periodic massacres, and then the Holocaust, of course, but even before the Holocaust, the sense that there was no place there anymore. but really the notion that Jews have always been inferior politically and socially and militarily for 2,000 years. So all of this was building blocks. At the same time, technically speaking, the truly Orthodox were opposed to the idea of taking history into their hands. And slowly that's been chipped away at, with the greater and greater success of the State of Israel as a economic, military, political entity. It's been chipped away at more and more. And more religious Jews have seen the virtue of sort of taking history into your hands and still interpreting that religiously as not being sacrilegious. But it started out as kind of a sacrilegious idea. But the reason why these original myths are important, even to an atheist or a secularist, is the same reason why original myths and stories would be important to a Cherokee who doesn't believe in the gods of the Cherokee Nation. It's just part of who you are. It's a foundational story. And it touches you deep in your soul, even if you don't believe in the more magical or religious, theological or dogmatic aspects of the story. It still resonates. And that kind of ambivalence, it's been part of the a critical recreation of a Jewish story that can either be viewed religiously or viewed actually from a ethno-nationally, without the need for a theological component or a divine component to it. I mean, think about it. You look at the Bible and you don't have to see it as written by God. You see it as written by ancient Jews claiming their rights to their homeland. And it's very powerful as a motivator. And that's why between secular and religious, the Jews who did end up in Israel or went to Israel are the ones that were the most committed to that vision. Now, as far as your second issue is concerned, that issue being again,
using the concept of unique injury and who can...
Yes, competing injuries and unique injuries, yeah. This is a constant struggle in circles of groups that have been, both of whom have suffered a great deal, and that is competing victimologies and victimhoods. And it's been, because the Holocaust is such a bitterly sore topic, there's been a strong ideological feeling among the most identified and nationalistic Jews that the Holocaust was unique. And there's actually a lot of academics committed to that and showing that it's a unique event in history, was unprecedented. And of course there are elements of truth to that. There are elements in the fact that there was unprecedented levels of mechanization and murder that only the 20th century could have allowed for. But it takes on a kind of mythic quality to it. There's a kind of mythic feeling of the Jews as a people that comes out of the religious sources, that the Gentiles are simply out to destroy us. And we have 1,000 years to prove it. And this is just the final proof that there's never been anything like the Holocaust. There's never been any such a strategic plan with so much precision to murder men, women, and children wholesale in this way. So then comes along the rest of the 20th century, and the genocides start adding up. And there's been a basic sort of chipping away at this that's not easy. Like, for example, the Armenian genocide, where a lot of Jews of conscience who are very committed to Holocaust memory are the ones that have been behind the idea of memorializing the Armenian genocide as well. Now, that's actually flown in the face of a tension here, and that is that Turkey has been a traditional ally of Israel until now. And now Turkey's pulling a little away, and now the United States and Israel are more comfortable with talking about the Armenian genocide. There's politics of genocide here too. But there's still this sense of uniqueness. Now, when it comes to what happens with Palestinian-Israeli conversations about this, is that there's just a very strong feeling in the Jewish community that whatever Jews have done wrong, they did it in the context of war and self-defense. And so you can complain about the conditions, but you have to look at all the causes and the fact that you're attacked and what do you do about terrorism. And you can't just look at the results in Gaza, you have to look at the causes. And what would you do if Katyushas were coming at you? What would you do if suicide bombers were coming at you? And saying, this isn't the Holocaust. This isn't a premeditated attack on a defenseless group of people. This is a war between two groups. And so they resent the idea of this being compared to the Holocaust. That having been said, and so when people do compare it to the Holocaust, or they do make comparisons to apartheid, it's usually meant to shock and provoke and to stimulate people to, rethink this. I tend to think it does the opposite in my experience. In my experience, when you have somebody who's behaving badly, but they've also gone through a terrible abuse, so that let's say you're, every class you're harassing me. And I happen to know your personal history that your father abused you. So at some point I'm going to fed up in class and I'll say, I'm not your father, and just because he abused you doesn't mean you should abuse me. And, well, it'll be shocking. I'm not sure that'll be the best way to handle it. Because I'll be comparing whatever horrible abuse you went through with the fact that you're just giving me a hard time as a teacher, which can't compare. You see? So from a strategic point of view, in terms of conflict resolution, I've never found that those comparisons were useful. But as time went on, I started to realize why people were doing it, that it wasn't just malicious. It wasn't just a way to re-injure. It was a way, in the course of the conversation, for Palestinians to try and get their Jews who they were in dialogue with to understand the depths of their pain. And I've had, important dialogues where private dialogues with some very senior people, and I was shocked that they made the comparison, and then I realized what they were trying to convey to me, that Gaza really was a concentration camp, that it was totally enclosed, it was cut off, and it's just a trap where everybody's just slowly dying. And so they were trying to convey that by using the imagery of the Holocaust. So I've gone back and forth in my levels of empathy for people using this, but I understand why, but it's also, it's a question we have to raise about whether even in the heat of conflict you need to respect the space of the other, the uniqueness of what they've gone through. I'll give you another example. Let's take an American example. Let's say in order to, you're having a black-white encounter of a city group in New York or some other place, and a white person gets to the point where they're trying to help the African Americans understand why we're afraid of you. We're afraid of you. You just don't get it. You may be afraid of the police, but we're afraid of you. You know why? Because I'm just as afraid to walk out on the street at night because of African American males who are in their teens as your people were in the South. So how would that go down? How would it go down? It might not go down very well. Because on the one hand, it's an empathetic effort to convey an analogy. But on the other hand, it's like, you have a choice. You can take a cab. You can, you have money. You have all sorts of things, How can you possibly compare the nightmare that we lived in? So that's why it's a little bit dicey. I want to focus these next couple of weeks on the question of how, given the narratives and the myths and the competing myths here, where the religions can possibly play a positive role, and an evaluation of that. You know, I've given some categories in the Johnston book of issues of the restoration of dignity, sharing of sacred space, memorialization, and issues of symbol, the question of boundaries, extension of boundaries to the other, issues of forgiveness and apology. All of these are things that people have worked with in this conflict to try and in different ways to extend the moral universe to the other. I think I've said before that one of the keys in all the religions I've ever studied, including Buddhism, not just the Abrahamic peoples, is that the biggest problem with their ethical categories are not the ethical categories, or not the ethical recommendations or obligations. It's the boundaries. It's who it extends to. The reason why the whole human rights agenda had to be born is because even in the best of times, without an abusive king, there were and are serious limits to the extension of religious love, friendship, respect, compassion to people who would be considered sinful or demonic in some fashion. And that's where human rights was born. It was born and it was nurtured by people who were hated and persecuted. Particularly as it got developed by Roger Williams and others, these were people who were children of persecution. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on with that? How does that work? And is it effective? So I know, for example, that in Israel, for years and years, for decades, some of the people who were originally part of the Buber's group, like Ernst Simon, who had wanted a binational state, well, it didn't get born. On the contrary, there was this birth of Israel, miraculous for Jews, catastrophic for Palestinians. All of these Palestinians driven out of their homes. And they continued to try, at first they tried to get the refugees back, some of these thinkers, and make the basis for that claim. Then they just sort of settled into trying to help with the Arabs of Israel to be equal citizens. A lot of the religious thinking went into, thinking and not action. And I remember supporting a group for 20 years, for a long time, where their principal contribution was how to develop a kind of moral Zionism, moral religious Zionism, with the extension of these categories of ethics to all people. So that if the Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus 19, that it means all neighbors. It doesn't mean just Jews, it doesn't just mean believing Jews. There are all sorts of strictures that were put on that in history. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting that just this week, or last week, there was a major letter by a lot of leading Muslim theologians and thinkers to the Christian community, not to the Jewish community, but to the Christian community, that was a gesture to them of what we hold in common. And two things they singled out, both have biblical Old Testament roots: a love of God and love of neighbor. And they were making this gesture to the Christian world, which they said, between the two of us, we have half the population of the planet, and surely we share at least this in common. And it was a very profound gesture. But I know the hermeneutics, I know the interpretations. Who's a neighbor? Who's a neighbor? This has been the contest since those words were written in Leviticus. who constitutes neighbor? How do you, I mean, human rights is a simple solution. It's not about loving your neighbor. It's about everyone having rights that are indivisible and inalienable. It's a very selfish, anthropocentric position, but paradoxically universal at the same time. My rights, but everyone can say that. It creates a society of competing individuals, each of whom can be absolutely selfish and say my rights. But if everybody's saying it, as long as everybody's saying it, it's actually a universal gesture. It's very different than God declaring to love your neighbors. Because loving your neighbors implies all sorts of altruism that can be very beneficial, that rights doesn't really include. But on the other hand, who's your neighbor, and who's in authoritative position to decide what God is saying as a neighbor and what is not? Who's a neighbor and who's a sinner? Who's a neighbor and who's a criminal? Who's a neighbor and who's damned to hell? This is where, in the long run, I think the social contract of the globe and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to have to be some combination of a very anthropocentric human contract on rights issues and a kind of moral, spiritual contract that builds community. This was Martin Buber's vision. They really did believe that there was a great potential for a binational state. I agree with them. I think that there was plenty of potential for it. There's no question that there were serious problems with both communities. The Jewish community was infected with a lot of European ideas that kind of made the Arabs unimportant. The biggest problem with the settlement and from the 1880s on was not so much that they intended on throwing out all the Arabs. That's not true. That evolved, especially in the 30s and the 40s. Terrible fascist time of history in general, where everybody was throwing out everybody. But from the 1880s on, the biggest problem was a sense that they didn't exist, which was a problem with European thinking in general about the other who was not white or who was not part of Europe. And so if they had paid attention, and this is what they were warned about by Jewish novelists and Jewish thinkers were telling their Zionist compatriots, look, you're not paying attention to the villages and the towns. If you pay attention to the Arab villages and the towns, you'll realize that these people don't necessarily want you to keep coming. And there's an issue here, there's a problem. Well, they acknowledged it was a problem in the Zionist conferences, but they didn't think it was the problem. They thought it was the British, and they felt it was, immigration and setting up, the economic system and all of this and all that. It was like, it just didn't get paid attention to. On the Palestinian Arab side, it was a couple of things that were tragic. It wasn't easy to see a way in which, it's there to this day. There's this sense in which if people are mostly farmers, or they're not from the European culture, they're not taken seriously. I mean, to this day, a lot of international development coming out of governments in the West is arrogant for that reason. It's just a sense that we know better. Clearly they don't, because they're poor or because they don't have our technology. That was a big part of what was going on. And so that enormous discipline that it would have taken for the majority of people coming over there to find a new life, Jews, to hold themselves back, hold their instincts back and listen, and sit in the villages and create the bases of a social contract. It would have taken enormous spiritual resources and cultural resources that really weren't in existence. It wasn't there in terms of the Jewish side. In terms of the Arab side, The Arab weaknesses in this regard were a lack of organization, a lack of modernization, a lack of coalescence. They were unprepared for a national movement in their midst. There was endless clan-based, fighting. And then there was the patriarchy. There was a lot about what Jews were developing that was very tempting. And to this day, I feel intuitively and strongly that the Palestinian national movement, particularly in the villages, is weak because half of their population is disenfranchised, namely the women. Everywhere you go in the world where women are subjugated, the culture can't compete with what's happening in the rest of the world today. Everywhere. And so patriarchy really, and the extent of the patriarchy, and frankly the brutality of it, has deeply hurt the possibilities of Arab development and Arab resistance to movements that are encroaching on their space. I believe that if there was so it's a perfect storm of a tragic set of incapacities. It doesn't appear to me that the Jews who came over, deeply wounded from being hated by Christians and Europeans for centuries, and also feeling at the same time the superiority of European culture, were in a condition to really reach out humbly to neighbors, include them in their social contract, and say, let's build a country together. They didn't seem to be in the emotional condition to do that, both wounded and also with European problems of racism. And on the Arab side, they didn't seem ready to be able to have that Western confrontation in a constructive way that was neither violent nor passive. And, okay.